Welcome to the Black and White Bistro and our fourth episode of How Did They Do That? I'm your host, DavidLPayne. Here we have an informal conversation with a black and white photographer, and we get their insights and views on how they took their image straight out of the camera all the way to the finished product. And hopefully along the way, you get a couple of tips to try it yourself. I'd like to welcome Mike Schaffner, who's joining us today as co-host. Mike is one of our Black and White Bistro baristas, and I invited him to join this conversation because he's got some experience with compositing, so I'm looking forward to hearing his views with Steve on this. Today, we're having a conversation with Steve Murdock, coming to us from California in the U.S. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing some of your black and white creative workflow. If you would, why don't you take a moment or two here and introduce yourself to our audience and talk about your photography.
Well, hi, audience. I'm Steve Murdock, one of many of my photographer buddies over here on YouTube. This is my Bureau. This is my second appearance here at the Bistro. I think the last time was about a year ago. Is that about right, David?
Yeah, almost exactly a year ago. Good memory.
So I'm out here knocking it out, portraiture, landscape, pretty much anything that can be photographed. I will take a picture of it and try and turn it into something reasonable to work with.
All right. Well, with that, let's just jump into it. The first question is for my benefit. I've not done a lot of compositing. So how would you describe compositing, Steve, for our audience members who may not be familiar with what the process is and what it entails?
Well, compositing in its most simple form is the combining of one or more images into a single image. Short and sweet.
He says, tongue in cheek. It's something that I've looked at and been considering, and now that I've switched from digital to film, I'm wondering how to do that. Have you shot film before, Steve?
Not in the context of an actual camera. You know, I've never shot more film than an Instamatic camera way back in the 70s. You know, just consumer grade stuff. So no. One of my good buddies used to be a fashion photographer who shot on film back in the 80s. So I get information about that anecdotally from him, but I've never worked in a darkroom.
I'm thinking about it for macro. I've got a friend of mine who's a professional photographer, uses Nikon equipment, and he was telling me that he uses compositing for fine macro shots.
Yeah.
So I'm curious. I'm really looking forward to seeing and understanding a little bit of how we do this. Mike, let's take it over to you.
Okay. Well, Steve, I'd like to ask you what's your process for setting up and actually taking the photo? I mean, for example, I know when we take a panorama shot, we got to overlap through the photos. Is there anything like that you have to do when making a composite?
You get on a slippery slope on that because it depends on the nature of the project you're doing. Each one has slightly different context. So theoretically, you can composite anything onto anything. You know, it's just a matter of whether it makes sense or not. And then you get into issues of, atmospheric matching, shadow agreement, light source agreement, all that sort of stuff. For things like panorama, yeah, you need some overlap, and technically it's a composite, even though it's a stitch, but it's less of an overlay, in my frame of reference, as opposed to say, focus stacking, which is also technically compositing. You pick your focus point, you shoot, 30 exposures and go through, until your final focus point, and then stack all those together. They're all compositing. The example we were going to do today is 3 action shots of the same subject overlapping, so you create basically multiple exposure after the fact, which is, I tend to play with that quite a bit.
So was your camera stationary, or did you move with the subject?
No, on this one, I was handheld. So I was just sitting street side during a marathon. So I had subjects running past me. So it was a series of exposures. I would say I probably took, let's see, for the event, because I didn't just do composites, but for the actual sports photography, I probably took 700-800 exposures. This particular setup, in front of this bank building, I probably took about 50 shots, and then found the most appropriate 3 candidates for what I wanted to accomplish with it. So, yeah.
Follow-up question, just real quick. You mentioned a word, and forgive the ignorance, but is compositing and stitching the same thing, or are there subtle differences?
Well, they're basically, you're combining multiple images, so they are in essence the same thing, I would say. Mike, would you agree with that?
Yeah, generally, yeah. There's the differences, but there are multiple images put together.
Yeah. So strictly, okay, in terms of this particular example of compositing, I think the key difference is that the parameter, it's a 2:3 frame for all 3 images, and that doesn't change. So the aspect ratio is the same, and it doesn't expand past the original parameters of whereas opposed to if you're doing a panorama, you're taking a couple of 2x3s or 4 or however many you're doing, and you're laying them side by side or one on top of the other. So, the size and the aspect ratio is a little more subject to change than an actual overlay, I would say would be the difference.
So stitching sounds like, let's assume you're in landscape orientation, you would take 2 or 3 shots that are, hence the word, stitched together on their extremities, and then you adjust or process that?
Yeah. Or basically, if the rule of thumb is if you're in landscape orientation, you're gonna pan up and down more favorably than side to side, so that you don't get that big long tubular thing. So you go up to square. But yeah. Or technically, I have a shot up on Bureau of Ocean Beach that I think was 12 shots that were composited. So that was 4 shots wide by 3 deep. So you still got that, 16:10 aspect ratio.
Yeah.
But, over several things, and then you stitch them together and clean them up, because that was moving water. So that's its own challenge. But yeah.
So we should change
factor, Dave.
Go ahead.
Another big factor, Dave, is stitching. You have to have some overlap, matching. Where compositing, you can, but you don't have to have any overlap. It could be 2 completely different things.
Yep.
Okay.
You can drop a banana over the top of it if you want.
Yeah.
To summarize it, I guess, I think this is what I'm understanding. Compositing, an easy way to think of it is multiple image shot in the same relationship, one on top of the other, and then in post-process, you pull them together.
Yeah, kind of.
Stitching sounds to me like it's the combining of 2 images. And to your point, Mike, about how that works, you need a little bit of overlap so that you can get continuity across the photo.
Right.
Is that fair?
That's fair.
Damn, I learned something today. This is great.
Yeah. So, I mean, as Steve says, you could put a banana into a landscape if you wanted to. Composite.
Okay.
We're going to have to ask Steve what it is with the bananas, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah, well, there's definitely going to be a follow-up on that one.
It's not complicated. It's just my deep love of the short A sound.
Yeah, well. Speaking of that,
yeah,
for both of you guys, if in my own application, what I'm considering this for is with black and white macro. Now I'm shooting with film.
mm-hmm.
So assuming there's no wind or breeze, I would take 2, 3, or 4 of the same frame macro shots, and then I could composite those to get better depth of field, better increased focus. Is that fair?
Well, David, sounds like you're describing something closer to focus stacking. Mike, would you say that was the case?
Yeah, that was my thought.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about focus stacking for a second then. That's great.
Yeah. So Dave, I think what you're getting to, especially if you're working on film, let's say that you're doing a macro shot of the stamen on a flower that's, oriented and poking out towards your lens.
Okay.
If you hit a focus point right at the tip of the stamen, right, or the pistil or whatever, whatever inner flower bit that you're taking a picture of, the one that's closest to you would be your primary focal point, and then you would pick a point farther down the flowery bit, which would be your final focal point. And then you just kind of take them in sequence, shifting the focal point slightly so that when you get them into the dark room, you'd be taking the focused element of each negative and superimposing them on each other until you got a tack chart image across multiple exposures. I think it's a lot easier to do with a digital camera, but as with most things, it was invented in film before it got into a digital. But yeah, I think that's what you're describing.
Well, like you said, in the old days, they had a dark room.
Yeah.
And they shot on film. All right. Now, today, I'm shooting on film, and I'm going to go into my post-processing software like Capture One, and I can use the focus stacking function in there.
Even easier. So yeah, if you got a solid scanner that'll get that into electronic mode, then yeah, it'll just read the focused areas and throw them together for you so that you get the sharpest possible image across the entire focal length.
Yeah. So once you've digitized your negative, Dave, you take it into the post-processing. It's the same as if you shot a digital photo.
So frame my subject. Let's just say it's a flower, no insects moving around on it.
Yeah.
And then focus on one part of the subject, capture. Don't move the camera, but change the focus slightly, shoot it again, change the focus slightly, moving the focal point through the depth of the photo.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And then I could do focus stacking, which is kind of like compositing.
It's a composite.
Yeah. Now, typical composites, though, Dave, would be if you take a picture of a photo and then you get Steve to dress up in an elf costume, and you cut and paste them out and put them on the edge of the flower,
holding the banana.
More typical composite as opposed to a focus stack.
And holding the banana, elf.
And holding the banana.
Steve, you're going to be getting a follow-up request. Let's see Steve as an elf with a don't go there. Don't go there. That's going to be great.
I don't know if I have to be paid at least scale for that kind of a job.
Okay. Well, we'll my agent will
yeah, that's my modeling area. So, completely different.
Okay. Stephen, our last question, Mike really got into some of the how did you actually shoot your composite images on site? I want to
Yeah.
take it to the back end now. Can you walk us through the steps in your post-processing workflow? And
Mhm.
which of those steps is the most challenging for you?
Well, let's see. On the clone runners image, and I think I mentioned previously, had a lot of candidates. So first trick is identifying the three that are going to give you um, the best array of the subject appearing in multiple positions. Um, the next thing that you do, once you've identified, in this case, the three images that you want to do, first thing you have to do, especially when you shot it the way I did, which was handheld. So there's going to be minute differences in the orientation. My horizon line was slightly askew, not radically, but enough that uh, you have to realign, uh, line up each of the images so that the hard landmarks, the sidewalk, the parameters of the building match. That way, the mobile subjects that are moving through the runners doesn't ultimately matter. They're all moving through what is essentially the same space, just at different time indexes. On this particular one, I have an individual in the background who's not a runner, so she appears 3 times. So I had to pick one where I liked her the best, and then excise her from the from the other 2 exposures, so that it was she appears one time as she was largely stationary and moving in the opposite direction, but very slowly, so it didn't really help. Um, and then once you've done that, that's all done in Lightroom. Um, then once you've lined everything up, you bring all that into Photoshop, and then you get into the masking, which is, in answer to your direct question, that's the hardest thing of all, especially
Amen.
because my runners were not good enough to me to maintain the same distance away from me running
Okay.
laterally. They rudely went slightly farther away or slightly closer to me. So
You
you
know
can
those
imagine
runners, they don't care about us
they just
photographers.
don't care at all. So I've got how many subjects do I have in this thing? One, two, three. Yeah, I've got 4 runners in this, all at a slightly different depth of field per exposure. So the real tough part of this one was masking each occurrence of the runner in such a way that wherever they were in time, as opposed to the one that they were running in front of on the previous exposure, still made sense on the z-axis. So
Wow.
who's throwing a shadow on one thing, so it moves into art after a certain point, because you're uh okay, this leg goes here, this foot goes there. I think I mentioned to you that one of the key things is shadows on the pavement. Absolutely vital. The shadows cast by the subject. I have all the shadows. The key is to not eliminate them accidentally when you're masking the picture out, because the worst thing you can do is get rid of the shadow that it's casting, because then it's no longer in the space. It just floats above it. And then you have to do a little bit of creative shadow creation in order to cast shadows on people that are further down the timeline, on the other people that are farther back in the timeline. So if I'm in front of the light source, I've got to cast a shadow on an element that technically wasn't there when I took the shot, but it was there a second ago. That's so the masking by far
Got
is
it.
the trickiest thing. Yeah. And then in this particular image, so once I got the masking done and I had all the elements where they were supposed to be, I also took the liberty of adding some path blur to the image. So each one of the subjects, now that I have them isolated as individual elements, I was able to apply a path blur, which kind of became an overlay thing, which gives you that streak of motion that each one of them has that's attached to their tonality. And then you have to work the mask out with those as well. Otherwise, things are overlapping with people where they weren't. So that, yeah, it gets quite arty in that section. And then once we had all that done, my process, and Mike, I think when you were on, how did they do that? We were talking about that structure out in the wilderness that you took.
Yeah.
And the importance of having your color range, so that that provides you with the basis of tonality. Same thing. So I process it all the way through as a color image down to saturation. A good array of colors. This particular one was prominent with reds and cyans, which are a good distance apart in terms of gray tonality. And then I've got some greens in the background. Everything was pretty much uniform yellow on the building, some pops of blue. So I had a lot of color elements that were going to give me a nice range going in black and white. So once it's fully done as a full color image, then my process is I throw a gradient over the top of the color image, but as a color only layer. So it becomes basically a flat conversion, but on a gradient as opposed to going straight grayscale. It gives you a little richer range. Then underneath that gradient, I start with a hue saturation layer and run each major color up and down the scale until I get to just where I like it. Then I do a similar process with the selective color layer underneath that. So each one has its red to cyan, it's green to magenta, and it's blue to yellow components, plus the whites, neutrals, and darks. And then after that, I run a final run with color balance. So shadows, midtones, and brights. You run those on the scale until you get it just the way you like it. And then in this particular one, I think I applied, I used a luminosity mask on the mids to darks, and then ran a curve adjustment just to improve the mid-range contrast. And then I think I ran sharpening over it. Inverse blurred sharpening is the technique I like to use these days. So make 2 copies of the layer, invert one, change the blend mode of the inverted layer to vivid light, blur that slightly, no more than a pixel. Group those, turn them into overlay group, and then mask them in as needed is, I think, how I sharpen this one. And Bob's your uncle, and you're off to the races.